So thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to Susan and the forum for inviting me this evening. So let's jump right in. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Richard Reutlinger and Joe Pecora, two connoisseurs who are extraordinarily generous in opening their amazing homes and collections over the years. Their passion inspired mine, and I hope you enjoy learning a bit about an understudied area of Victorian design with me this evening. Tonight, we'll see both European and American items from my collection in Neo-Grec style, which peaked between the 1860s and the early 1880s. Let's start with some original source material from my period design books. This is one of the deluxe catalogs of the 1862 International Exhibition. Note the industrial art in the title. Despite what antique dealers may say, by the 1860s, firms with teams of designers, specialized craftspeople, and equipment had really supplanted small shops with a single craftsman doing all the handwork. These firms use the latest manufacturing technologies to produce elaborate and beautiful decorative arts. Exhibitions and their catalogs showcase the world's finest pieces to foster public demand for artistically designed, industrially produced products. So let's see some of that work. To start, we'll take a look at this mantelpiece. This book shows a number of Neo-Grec pieces, and it actually mentions the style by name, proving that Neo-Grec isn't a term invented by 20th century curators, it's a term from the period. Critics in the 1860s recognized that the style was both based on ancient Greek precedents, but also something new and creative. Let's look more closely at this piece. We've got a few details that I'm going to point out, the first of which is the overall polychromy on the mantle. It's not the pristine white marble neoclassicism that you might be familiar with from the 18th century. The color palette here is a lot of blacks, bronzes, patinated greens, and bright reds and blues. That's important because that was a big kind of academic debate in the period. Were Greek statues white marble as we see them today, or were they colored? And of course, we know that they were colored, and the Neo-Grec designers picked up on that. We'll also note that the forms are thin and elongated, and we have a lot of different Greek style motifs, including we've got some winged panthers, some classical statuary here, Athena, and spiky Anthemion. And we'll go into more of this throughout the presentation. One thing to note about the pieces that I'm going to show you from this exhibition catalog is they were all primarily one-offs. They were made to advertise the exhibitor's quality and achievements and to showcase the latest styles. And this mantelpiece specifically cost about 600,000 francs to produce. In today's money, that when you calculate by the cost of a day's worth of labor, that's about $300,000 in today's dollars. So these exhibition pieces are extreme luxury items. They're not for the mass market, but we will see some of those mass market items later in the talk. This French silver vase also shows some key motifs. We have some pendant chains. We have an ornament called an Anthemion, which you see right here. We have palmettes, which are similar to Anthemions, but a little bit different. And we have other spiky floral ornaments that are really characteristic of the Neo-Grec style. And while the French may have originated the style, the English used it as well. This cabinet was submitted for exhibition by Gillows of Lancaster and London, and it includes a variety of those motifs as well. We've got Anthemions, we have portrait busts and medallions, we have vine-wrapped columns, and winged panthers. And the text that accompanies this plate is really worth quoting, so I'll give a little sampling of the writing in this book. Under Napoleon III, when England had almost completely rid itself of its pseudo-Grecian school and the affectation of the Gothic revivals had become almost universal, the French again returned to ancient Greece for models. There is great scope for variety and richness and decoration in the style. We hope to see it applied by competent artists so as to neutralize, in a measure, the eccentricities of the medieval school, the well-worn compositions of the Renaissance, and the redundant commonplace of what we may call the style of the Bourbons. So I love the writing and the overstuffed prose in this book, just because it's so characteristic of the era. But I also love the way that this passage shows that design critics really understood the source material for these 19th century revival styles and the degree to which they were copies or original creative remixes. 20th century modernist architects and historians would have you believe that the entire 19th century was only poor and inaccurate rehashes of earlier styles. But this text shows that the more sophisticated designers and firms engaged in purposeful, creative reinterpretation. And of course, Neo-Grec, in my mind, as one of these more original and creative takes on classicism, didn't limit itself to archaeological exactitudes. The discoveries at Pompeii, which is a Roman resort city with Greek and Etruscan roots, was just as much, if not more, an important source of inspiration as the actual Greek models were. And here, I'm showing you another English cabinet, which was made of various dyed exotic woods imported from New Zealand, which was newly discovered around this period by the West and the British specifically. And it's masquerading kind of as a third style Pompeian wall painting, which shows that source of inspiration I was just mentioning before. And the German-speaking world was also working in style. These plates are from a magazine aimed at the cabinet-making trade that was published in both German and English editions in the 1870s and 80s, and each contained model decorative arts engravings and a full-sized measured set of design drawings for furniture or decorative patterns that were featured in the issue. So these were really used as source material for production both across Europe and in the Americas. So let's take a look at some of the recurring themes and motifs from antiquity that really define the Neo-Grec style. Here we have some Greek and Roman examples that exemplify those key traits. We've got the linear clarity of this Greek Enthemian stone. We've got the flat painted ornament from ceramics. We have the Roman love of color and fanciful composition that we can see in these frescoes from Pompeii. And so we're going to see some of that stuff as we look through some of these pieces. The history of 19th century design that's written in the 20th century, they really focus on how it was a period of historical revival styles. And this is true. And many of them, especially those written before the 1980s, bemoan how these copies were not accurate, were cheapened by industrialization, and therefore were bad designs. And on this, I most thoroughly disagree. As we've seen, the actual situation is more complex and nuanced, and there are instances of direct copying of previous eras, but much of the 19th century material reflects creative remixing. There are so many distinct but overlapping styles during the last half of the 19th century that it can be hard to categorize a piece. Neo-Grec is often confused with Renaissance revival, and they do share a lot of similar traits. But I would contend they are actually at opposite ends of a unified spectrum. On the left end of the spectrum, we have Renaissance revival, which has more naturalistic representation. And by that, I mean like shaded in 3 dimensions, very close to what something looks like to the eye. We have a lot of virtuoso carving, broken contours, and a closer historic following of detail. And at the right end of the spectrum, we have more Neo-Grec qualities. So over here, which include a more stylized ornament, more flat carving, smooth contours, and an open-ended inspiration from design history sources. So knowing that, let's look at some examples in detail. So here, we're going to start at the Renaissance revival end of the spectrum. This is a canonical European, historically precedented Renaissance revival cabinet, and it was exhibited at the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition. It closely follows the characteristics of actual cabinets from the Renaissance. It's got a stepped architectonic massing. You can see here in the pediment with its volute scrolls. It has a wealth of naturalistic carved ornament, from the figures to the swags to all of the details all over the cabinet. And it also has heavy and exaggerated profile moldings, as you can see here on the legs. But unlike Europeans, most American firms lacked access to genuine Renaissance pieces to study and copy. So when they wanted to work on something in the Renaissance Revival style, they did something a little bit different. Here we have a chair that's by John Jelliff of New Jersey. And we have, just like in the cabinet that I was just showing you, we have naturalistic carving in portrait busts, an overall sense of kind of solid heaviness in the chair overall. We have a profusion of carved detail everywhere, from the crest to the ears, to the bust, to the front. And in the needlepoint upholstery, you'll see that we have a variety of thread shade colors used to give the naturalistic, illusionistic appearance of dimension in the upholstery textile. And although this chair is not an accurate copy of a Renaissance seating form, the subject of the carving has Renaissance details, like the helmet and the scalloped detailing in the drapery on the busts. And also note here the concave sides of the chair and the way it flares out towards the ears at the top of the chair. This is a Renaissance revival detail that I think was introduced as makers searched for more novel forms to distinguish their wares from the more round, convex frames of earlier Rococo chairs. So on a Rococo chair, this style up along the top of the seat would actually curve out like this, instead of curving in, as you see on this chair. Taking one step to the right on the spectrum, this Egyptian revival chair by a New York firm has a slightly less busy outline, some flat marquetry in place of carving, and again, portrait busts on the arms. And an important detail here is the portraits are less animated in the expression of the face. They're more stylized and they're more grave. And this reflects the solemn, static character of Egyptian art, which also inspired early archaic Greek statuary. This side chair is a transitional piece moving towards the Neo-Grec. We still have the concave sides that I was mentioning earlier that are typical of a Renaissance revival chair, but the details are moving in a definitively more Neo-Grec direction. We've got these ribbed anthemions, and you can see here this kind of leaf shape that's elongated and stretched out with the ribbing in it. That's what I mean by the ribbed anthemion. They're a key motif. And we also have this very iconic conical leg form, which is inspired by the legs of a Greco-Roman cline. And that's K-L-I-N-E, cline. It's the kind of Greco-Roman couch that diners would lie on while eating in their dining room. In Latin, it's called the triclinum, which also gives us our word recline. So you know what a recliner is. That is the source of today's recliners, linguistically at least, if not stylistically. And this rosewood chair by Herder Brothers, although it's vigorously carved, it takes a step further away from representation towards stylization of the motifs in the carving. And here you can see that the carved ornament consists of volute scrolls on the knees of the chair here and in various places where the structural members are joined together. We've got circular bosses that have a little bit of a floral hint to them. And we also have anthemian floral ornaments here on the front of the apron of the chair. Also note that the ears up at the corner have gone away and the back is all smooth curves. So here the heavy Renaissance revival border is starting to don a rich cloak of Greek ornament instead of Renaissance ornament. This English chair takes an even further step towards a pure Neo-Grec style with its very shallow anthemian carving here on the top and on the stretcher. And the light frame, it almost has a Sheraton, a Hepplewhite, an 18th century flavor to the overall structural part of the chair. And we see again those tapered conical legs that I just mentioned when talking about the Greco-Roman cline. And this ebonized chair really sits on the threshold between the Neo-Grec and the Anglo-Japanesque. Here we have more highly stylized ornament, including those anthemions, which we'll see a lot of this evening, up here and right here. We also have some classically inspired drapery originating out of these floral pieces right here. We've got volute scrolls, and we also have ivy vines, which we'll see a little bit more of as well. But the bottom of this chair is more geometric in character, and it has a distinctly American Eastlake flavor, demonstrating how there were incremental changes between recognizable styles. And now that we've seen some of those key details in the furniture in my collection that help distinguish Neo-Grec from Renaissance Revival, let's take some look at ancient source material and the third quarter 19th century items that they inspired. So here, let's take a close look at this tripod table from Pompeii. It was recently on show at the Legion of Honor, so I hope everyone in the audience perhaps had a chance to see it in person. It's a wonderful piece and quite famous. Notice the legs in the ornament here and on the knees of the leg right here. This floral ornament is composed of smooth, unbroken, tangential curves. And this is what I mean when I mention Greek stylization or linearity. So it's that kind of graphic quality that I'm talking about, where these curves, smoothly transition from one into the other without any joints or major breaks. And this tripod is also a perfect example of how one object can be reinterpreted through history. On the left, we have the earlier photo of the original Pompeii piece that we were just looking at the detail of. And in the middle, we have an engraving by Piranesi from 1778. And notice that the ornament that I was just talking about on the knees and here, the bracing on the inside is transformed into a much more detailed and almost fussy Roman acanthus scroll. And he's also changed the proportions of the leg, the base, and the sphinxes themselves. And on the right is an engraving of the same piece from almost exactly 1 century later. This linear Greek character of ornament has returned, and here it's depicted accurately. In part, these differences may be due to drawing from memory instead of life. Access to Pompeii artifacts was fairly restricted, and you couldn't always bring drawing materials with you when you had the opportunity to view them in the 18th century. In the 19th century, Pompeii was much more open to visitors, artists, designers with pen and pencil in hand. But I think this difference in the drawing and the style also shows that no matter how closely one references source material from antiquity, the particular preferences of the designer and their time period, aka this love of a more Roman fussy acanthus ornament, always seem to creep in. Neoclassicism is a living tradition that evolves with each generation. And in this French candelabra, we see the exaggerated and elongated shapes and ornament from 3rd and 4th style Roman frescoes. So you can see here, we've got the column, and we see this very similar columns illustrated in this mid-19th century archaeological volume by Wilhelm Zahn, who was a German archaeologist who really produced several large books documenting the frescoes and discoveries at Pompeii. And that material, I'm sure, circulated and made it to the eyes of designers like Barbadine working on pieces like this. And we see that resemblance even more strongly in this lamp and stand. This piece closely, but not exactly, follows the overall design of various lampstands found in Pompeii. And here we see them engraved in that same 1870s Naples Museum catalog that we saw the tripod table in, and we'll see a few more from that catalog. I imagine it was a very important source material for a lot of designers over the course of the century. And here, notice that the stem incorporates these leafy sepal designs from the Roman fresco paintings and lithographs that we were just seeing on the previous slides. And this set of candles, small candlesticks, also display that same elongated vertical ductility. The tripod base and the stem have an almost sinewy tension in the way that they emphasize the vertical. And also note the highly stylized rendering in the floral elements and the sharp lines and the planar quality of the panther faces. That same sense of attenuated form is present in this set by Killian Brothers of New York City. This firm produced a variety of ebonized and polychrome painted pedestals with characteristic Neo-Grec pendant chains and metal mounts. And you may remember those from the French vase print we saw earlier. Here you can see that same black, red, and green color scheme that we saw on the mantelpiece at the beginning of the presentation. And one very important thing to note about both of these designs is they are entirely composed of elements that would be easy to make on a steam-powered lathe or a jigsaw. Both of those are labor-saving production techniques that allowed them to produce fancy ornamental furniture in large volumes at a widely affordable cost. So this is getting back to that industrialization of luxury for the masses. This clock has the familiar outline of a Greek temple with its pediment, cornice, and frieze, and the garniture urns are shaped like a kylix, which is a kind of Greek cup used for drinking wine. It's luxurious, highly ornamental, but primarily executed with techniques suitable for industrialized manufacture. This incised stone carving that we see at the base and around the face of the clock may have been done with the aid of a pantographic machine, which increases the speed and accuracy of executing an engraved design. And here, this is an example of an engraving pantograph, which allows an operator to trace a template and to reduce or enlarge it onto another material. These machines were used to engrave metal printing type, currency printing plates, and jewelry and silver. I suspect a similar technology was also combined with steam-driven belt systems and used for the efficient production of machine-aided carving in wood and stone, just like we saw on that clock. This pair of vases is a transitional piece. They have Rococo Revival elements in the decoration, but also a very distinctive conical Neo-Grec shape, which gives us that same sense of upward motion we saw in some of the earlier pieces. Ceramic production was one of the first areas to be fully industrialized by the 18th century. This shape would be challenging to produce by hand on the wheel, but it easily lends itself to being made with the aid of a lathe or a mold. And a closer look at the details reveals a style transition in progress. Here we see in naturalistic flowers and ribbons, which is a sentimental Rococo motif, surrounded by gilding reminiscent of ancient jewelry, here on these kind of pendant chains that we see towards the bottom of the design, and the Roman acanthus frieze at the top. These defining composition features of third style Roman fresco painting is surrounding a naturalistic rendered illusionistic scene with a frame of flat, stylized ornament, as we see here. This mantle clock and garniture urn set also have a sense of very dynamic motion. The volute curves and the attenuated handles on the vases set up invisible lines that draw the eye through the entire piece. And I think of it as the ornamental equivalent of contrapposto posing in classical Greek sculpture, which simultaneously embodies graceful stillness with the sense of a potential for motion. This clock and candelabra set from the 1862 industrial art catalog we saw earlier exhibits the exact same stylistic qualities. And here, note that we have the pediment, the pendant chains, and gilt ornament that resembled the transitional vases that we just saw. Now that we've covered some of the key style traits, let's look at some of the distinctive Neo-Grec motifs. Here we have a silver cup by Gorham, and those portrait medallions that you see here are a key motif of the Neo-Grec style. And it also includes a lot of those enthymemons that we saw earlier, both in the handle up here in 3 dimensions and in the engraving over here on the left near the portrait medallion. These medallions were inspired by Roman cameo jewels like these in the collection of the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. And silver flatware decorated with these portrait medallions also enjoyed wide popularity. This is a selection from Schulz and Fischer of San Francisco. And Eastern manufacturers also produced similar designs, each with their uniquely identifying details. The 2 on the left by Hotchkiss and Schroeder depict Dionysus, the god of wine, and the 2 on the right are Gorham pieces that used notably Greek shapes in their handles and engraving. Portrait busts were also used as sculptural ornaments. Here we see a gaslight chandelier by Iden Company of New York from 1877. And note on the center column that we have very Greek wave volute scrolls around the rim of this bell crater. And a crater is a Greek urn used to mix water and wine during a formal dinner party called a symposia. And perhaps this fixture once ornamented a convivial American dining room. Elaborate formal dining was one of the key entertainments and social rituals of the 19th century. So you can really see, they took dining very seriously and were very interested in bejeweling their tables and rooms as they went through their dining. Painted portrait medallions were a common decorative motif in Neo-Grec ceramics. This small and somewhat naively painted bud vase was likely an attempt to make the style available at a more affordable price point. We see the same conical sloped sides and the bright blue matte glaze as we saw in the earlier floral vases. And in a charming contrast to this humble vase, the woman depicted on it appears to be wearing a string of pearls and a Tyrian purple dyed headdress, both of which were extremely expensive luxury items in ancient Rome, a true example of the luxury of the ancients industrialized for the masses. And on a slightly more massive scale, we have this rosewood parlor cabinet by Alexander Roux, a New York maker best known for his earlier Rococo revival and Renaissance revival works. And it's not as elaborate as pieces by other high-end firms by the Herder brothers, but this cabinet with its portrait medallion, its marquetry, its incised gilt carving, and gilt bronze ornaments would have been a luxurious addition to any parlor. Roux started his firm in 1837 after immigrating from France. And this piece is from the 1860s, and it shows that American firms were able to adopt and adapt the changing tastes coming from Europe. Despite the French origin of the style, and Roux himself, this cabinet has several telltale features that demonstrate the unique character of Neo-Grec furniture production. In the mid-19th century, various revolutions and political unrest depressed wages in the furniture trades in France and Germany. And this caused many skilled craftsmen to immigrate to the United States, particularly to New York City. One of the major American innovations in furniture was the degree to which firms were ready and eager to adopt new labor-saving technology. We know that by the 1850s, Roux employed 120 craftsmen and had steam-powered machinery in his factory. And this cabinet is an excellent example of that industrialized artistic labor. The incised carving that we can see here all around the frame, the cornice, the base, that's very well suited to machine-assisted techniques. The gilt metal ornaments and the marquetry were likely stock designs that were produced by specialists and possibly imported from France and incorporated to the overall design. So they're not making every aspect of this cabinet in-house. They're outsourcing some of that labor to specialized craftsmen and bringing it in. Furniture producers like Roux used a standardization of forms with variation in details to increase their efficiency and profitability. And the cost of creating a design and making up of appropriate templates and tooling could be spread across many pieces, while changing smaller details like carving and the mounts applied to each piece to keep the designs fresh and unique. Different qualities of wood, finishes, and ornament could be applied to the same basic forms to offer options at different price points, which allowed the firms to sell to a variety of consumers from the prosperous upper middle class to the unfathomably wealthy robber barons. And indeed, we see that Roux applied exactly this mix and match technique to his Neo-Grec productions. On the left is a cabinet in the collection of the Smithsonian, nearly identical to mine in form, and it has that same exact portrait medallion, but it has very different marquetry panels. It has ebonized finishes, different gilt mounts, and different ornamental patterns carved into the various parts of the piece. And on the right, we have a deluxe double wide version of that same form at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where we have additional ormolu work, which is gilt bronze. We have painted porcelain plaques instead of a gilt metal plaque. And we have larger marquetry panels and extra gilt bas reliefs here in the center of the console to coordinate with the porcelain plaques. So this really shows how you could have the basic similar form, but elaborate it for a more discerning or just well-heeled clientele. And as I mentioned when talking about the spectrum between Neo-Grec and Renaissance revival earlier, 19th century design really proceeded incrementally. Novel features were gradually incorporated into existing forms and styles. And we see that here in this bed headboard, which really combines Neo-Grec elements like this Anthemian pediment at the top and these very kind of Neo-Grec columns along the sides with more American Eastlake elements like the spindle gallery here, this coved projection, and the storybook incised carving. So this is a really great example of someone who is maybe not quite ready to go all Eastlake as the style gained popularity and produces a lot of interesting hybrid furniture during these transitional periods. So now that we've covered some of the major graphic motifs, I want to move on to more symbolic and mythological content from classical antiquity in Neo-Grec design. The most important is the god of wine, Dionysus to the Greeks or Bacchus to the Romans. And you will recall seeing Dionysus depicted on the head of the Hotchkiss and Schroeder flatware that we saw earlier when we were talking about dining accoutrement. And these two statues from Pompeii really thoroughly show his iconography. Naturally, he has, a leafy, viney crown of grapes and the wine jug, but also less obvious attributes like the thrysus staff tipped with a pine cone and often wrapped in ribbons or ivory, and his companion, the panther. In contrast to later English design reform movements, we have very little written source material about how Neo-Grec designers thought about their design inspirations and what ideas or philosophy inspired them. I can only speculate that many of them being French or of French origin enjoyed luxury for luxury's sake, and a good party like Dionysus and his followers. So perhaps they were all hedonists, or at least catering to that market. Here we have a set of silvered bronze candelabra from France that really live out that philosophy. There are actually two direct references to ancient source material in this pair. The first is the panther head and paw tripod lampstand, which was found at Pompeii and is now, as you might have guessed, in the Naples Museum. This happens to be a print from a different catalog, not the same one we've been looking at each evening, but a reference of Greek ornamental motifs. And instead of the enthymeme that we see here in the original, we have the ivy leaf instead, which is another Dionysus reference in addition to the panthers. And note that this design also uses that sepal leaf element from the bronze floor lamp that we saw earlier. The second reference are to the two ancient statues that top off the pair. I've not identified the male statue yet, and if anyone knows it, please get in touch. But the female figure is directly derived from the Aphrodite Kalapygos, again in the Naples Archaeological Museum. And the approximate translation of this statue's name is the Aphrodite of the beautiful posterior, which is proof that not all 19th century folks were prudes. And one interesting detail about this statue is it is an ancient Roman copy, but you can see very clearly that it has had some restorations, both from the 16th and the 18th century. This bronze taza is covered in grapevines, another Bacchic element, and has a shape somewhere between a kylix and a very low cantharos, both of which are cups that were used for wine drinking and are associated with the Bacchic cult. And let's finish with this newel post gas lamp in the form of a winged panther. Note here we've got the flat ornament on the chest, on the wings, on the base, on the wings here, and in the lamppost, that Greek style ornament. And the panther again has this very planar and angular, sharp molding of the face and wings, one of the key stylistic elements that we were talking about earlier. And this particular piece has a San Francisco connection. The andiron version of the same design is depicted in this 1886 ad from the California Architect and Building News. And you can see from the engraving that the panther originally carried a bit in its mouth with pendant chains, like the candelabra and the plant stands that we saw earlier. I believe that the angular and the planar quality of Neo-Grec work like this is one of the key inspirations for the Art Deco style of sculpture and shows how there is a continuous thread of inspiration, influence, and reinterpretation throughout the history of neoclassical design across 5 centuries. I want to thank you all for letting me share my collection and passion with you this evening, and I hope that you found it both entertaining and illuminating, as we see in this etched shade on top of that panther lamp that has a variety of Greco-Roman heroic motifs engraved on it. Thank you.
Well, all I can say is bravo, Kyle, you are such a treasure. That was such a terrific lecture. I'm sure everyone agrees. Before we get to the Q&A, I would just like to remind ADAF members that we do have a wonderful reception planned at Kyle's home on Saturday, let me check my calendar.
26th?
26, yes, 26.
Yep.
It is for reception and above level members because we had to keep the numbers limited. But there are still a few openings. So if you are interested in experiencing these fabulous, fabulous objects in person with Kyle on the 26th, please do email me and I will try to fit you in to our day's activities. So I am
very much looking forward to having everyone over to see this and more items and the house that are in the collection.
Yes, very exciting opportunity. So please do email me if you're interested. So I'm going to move on now to some Q&A. I'm going to start with the first one from Jeffrey Ruda. Hi, Jeffrey. Wonderful talk, beautifully organized and articulate. Thanks so much. I couldn't agree more. I'd be very grateful to have discussion of either of these questions. One, very few of your examples have the rich polychromy, polychromy, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, of Pompeii frescoes. Was that deliberate, or have marquetry and other woods faded over time? Question, do you want to take that?
Yeah, we'll answer both. I think we'll have
Okay.
time for both. So.
Okay, and the second question, I don't understand what J.B. Waring and his contemporaries meant by, in quotes, pure taste. Can you help me with that?
Sure. So I'll address the first one. I think in part, obviously I don't have a museum's worth of collection. So I'm sure there are other pieces out there that have, especially in furniture, that have a more wide use of high polychromy, especially in ceramics. Obviously it's much easier to achieve there than in wood. That piece that we saw at the very beginning, the English one made out of the dyed wood from New Zealand, I think was a real, kind of a one-off showpiece. I'm not sure how common that technique was in your more everyday production furniture. The area where I feel like you would be most likely to see that kind of polychromy is actually in the painting of the walls and in the textiles used on furniture like this. And of course, textiles very rarely survive. And, of course, in buildings, they're frequently repainted, repapered. And that's where I think the real Pompeian color schemes, have their biggest impact. In furniture, you can have woods that are dyed or, naturally more vibrant. And yes, light does over time darken or lighten woods depending on their exposure and, their exact chemical basis. But I don't think beyond kind of that Killian Brothers lower level furniture where painting was used as a cheap finish to fancy up things that were otherwise, more efficiently produced. That's where you see it. And you do see, like in Herder Brothers, you will see more painted details like in the casing itself. But I, don't have a particular example of that kind of piece in my collection beyond what's in the plates that we showed at the beginning. And in terms of the J.B. Waring and the pure taste, what he's referring to there at the beginning of the quote is really what we would call the Greek revival in American architecture, where they were making buildings that were very strictly based off of archaeological examples down to the exact proportions of the moldings. That's a very common way of approaching architecture, like in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. It was really about, here's the Acropolis, here's the, whatever the particular temple that they were modeling after, and following those details in a very academically studied way. And by the 1840s, like that, archaeological precision in revival architecture had kind of fallen by the wayside because, like, a railway station that looks like a Greek temple, might be wonderful or might be just comically bad. And so I think what a lot of architects were debating and realizing is like, this ancient source material is great for inspiration, but we have new industrial style building types like large libraries, railway stations, large hotels that just won't fit behind that 5-column portico or 4-column portico that you're used to seeing on the Tara style plantation house or other kind of classic Greek revival elements. And so that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the pure taste. It's they didn't have the architecture history terms for Greek revival yet. And so he's referring to a period about 20 to 30 years before he's writing.
Okay, so moving on, we have many responses just saying thank you and what a fabulous job, all of which I concur.
Thank you very much.
And just this is a nice comment too that you should know, Kyle, that from Megan Smith saying she enjoyed your talk very much. Richard and Joe would have been so touched and proud. So.
Yeah. I mean, like I said at the beginning, they, seeing their houses at an early age when I was in college here in San Francisco and just being blown away. It was a huge source of like, ooh, what is all this stuff? I have to learn more about it. And, just down the rabbit hole we go, Alice.
Dan Riley would like to know what got you started in this collecting in this particular area.
Sure. So, I've always been interested, from a young age in art and design, and studied that in college. The one thing that I think got me the most interested in Victorian material specifically is for a summer job between my freshman and sophomore year in college. I did door-to-door fundraising for the Human Rights Campaign and got to knock on doors in houses all across San Francisco and the East Bay and saw a lot of Victorian homes and was like, these are wonderful, fascinating, crazy, zany. I need to know more about them. So, my interest started from just seeing these houses and living in San Francisco. Neo-Grec more specifically, I think it's an area that's very understudied and just suits my particular taste. I've always had an interest in classical mythology and just spiraled from there. And they're exquisitely beautiful pieces. What's not to love?
Lynn Springer Roberts would like to know, do you think the earlier designs of Owen Jones played a role in some furniture designs?
Yes. I mean, I can only imagine that, just the existence of the grammar of ornament alone was a huge factor in, kind of this historic encyclopedia of designs from, both classical antiquity, Egypt, Assyria, China, Japan, all over the world. That interest was already there, but Owen Jones is one of the central people who really played a part in, publishing that. And he was also involved in the creation and the decoration of some of these great exhibitions like the Crystal Palace exhibition. So I do think he was very influential. And when I talked about that idea of flatness, of not the virtuoso, exactly what the flower looks like carving, but instead that geometric, ornamental, like head-on kind of almost scientific view of like what a flower or a leaf looks like as a, like as a system instead of like a photograph. That theory comes a lot from Owen Jones. He talked a lot about the appropriateness of different kinds of design for different kinds of items. For example, he would say, like a carpet should not be three-dimensionally shaded because, walking on a pile of flowers is ludicrous. A carpet should be flat. It should be even tone color without shading, and it should be more geometric and stylized because it's a flat piece that lays on a floor, and it should respect the logic of that flatness. So it's kind of an early, more wordy version of, like form follows function. Of course, like everything that the 20th century modernists talked about theory-wise was lifted, edited down word-wise, and completely stolen from 19th century design theorists. So they're not really those 20th century folks were presenting nothing new or radical. They were just editing down and condensing ideas that already exist from folks like Owen Jones.
And Doug Lambert would like to know, at the beginning of your lecture, Kyle, you showed a few monumental, fabulous exhibition pieces that were exhibited in the 19th century at early World's Fairs. Are any of them known to still exist today? And if so, are their whereabouts known?
Yes, and I don't have an exacting list, especially for the ones that I specifically showed. I'm not sure if any of those exist in collections today, but the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was basically founded around the time of that first 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition, was really an attempt by the government, especially Prince Albert, to say like, hey, this is a wake-up call. British design kind of is lackluster, especially in these industrial manufacturers. We need to up our game against the French. And so the whole idea of the Victoria and Albert Museum at its beginning was to collect examples of exemplary design to teach the public, including manufacturers and future budding designers, to show them the best of the best and set an example. They also collected examples of bad designs and had a whole hall of horrors of like, overstuffed, over floral wallpapers and such that people at the time thought were bad design examples. But yes, those pieces do exist. Some of them were bought by the Victorian Albert shortly after the exhibition. I'm sure similar pieces were acquired, by French museums. The Metropolitan Museum specifically has a French cabinet that's kind of a neo-Norse style almost, that's in their collection, that was purchased. I'm not sure if it was directly from an exhibition, but it was originally shown at one of these exhibitions. And I know that there is a kind of a massive monumental, very early Renaissance revival cabinet that I believe is owned now by a museum in the Midwest. And I'm forgetting exactly which one, but it's one of the ones that's depicted in a catalog of this type. And so yes, they are out there. They do exist. And when curators discover that they have one, or one comes to market and they have that catalog to go back to and prove it, oh, do they get excited?
I think that's about it for our Q&As, unless someone has a quickie that you'd like to throw in here now before we conclude.
Oh, it looks like someone commented that Renaissance cabinet is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So I'll have to go pay it a visit sometime and take some photos.
Yes, and we have a question from David Barquist. Hello, David. How great to hear from you. The Renaissance cabinet Kyle showed early in the talk is now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Oh, that's what you were commenting on, Kyle. So yeah. And Jeffrey Ruda would like everyone to know that for 19th century exhibition pieces, there was a great show in 2012 at the Carnegie Institute, Pittsburgh, and the Nelson Atkins Museum with a beautiful companion book. So go on to Amazon and find your copy, folks. Any other questions? Anyone like to submit something before we conclude this evening? I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure hosting everybody here this evening, and I hope you enjoyed Kyle's talk as much as I did. Kyle, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, and I will say before everybody departs, if you enjoyed this lecture, as always, we have to promote the next upcoming one. In March, we will have a very fascinating presentation about weather vanes and their kind of motifs and symbologies in folk art. And let me look up the date real quick so you can all put it on your calendar and attend with us. So the date of the weather vane lecture will be March 15th, same Zoom time and same Zoom place. And thank you all for tuning in this evening. I hope you enjoyed it and hope you are looking forward to our full year of season programs. And we're hoping that soon we'll be able to do simulcast and in-person events from the museum. So tune into your newsletters for more information as those plans and our lecture schedule for the year are firmed up, as we hopefully will be able to return to a more open and normal life in the future months. Thank you.
Let me before you close out, also, let me just add that we have a wonderful lecture plan for April as well. Alexander Kirtley from the Pennsylvania Museum of Art will be talking to us on, let me get my date. On to quickly flipping through the calendar. It is Tuesday, April 19th. And
the title of that one is A Rising Tide Lifts All Ships, New Galleries of Early American Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So it's all about their reinstallation, the research, the contextualization that they are now providing in their newly reopened galleries about the history of American art and design. So I'm sure it will be, I've seen a few of the photos and they are delicious. So I hope you all tune in for that as well.
Thank you for filling in my gaps there, Kyle. I think I said Pennsylvania Museum of Art. Oh, sorry, Philadelphia. It's time for an evening glass of wine, I think, everyone. But
indeed.
Indeed, yes.
Well, everyone, I hope you enjoy that evening glass of wine, and perhaps you have a Kylix right there at your disposal to drink it from this evening. Good
night, everyone. Thank you.